The bolt-action rifle built the modern world's armies. In the final decades of the 19th century, military planners across Europe and beyond faced a crisis of standardization. Their infantry carried a patchwork of outdated muskets, single-shot breech loaders, and early repeaters. No two units armed alike, no two cartridges interchangeable. The solution, when it came, was elegant and ruthlessly practical. The bolt-action rifle gave every soldier the same weapon, the same ammunition, and the same fighting chance. Three designs defined the era. Britain's Lee Enfield, adopted in various forms from 1895 onward, became famous for its unusually smooth, fast-cycling action. A trained British soldier could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute, a rate that stunned German infantry at Mons in 1914, and who reportedly mistook the volume of fire for machine guns. Germany answered with the Gewehr 98, designed by Peter Paul Mauser. Mechanically precise, supremely accurate at long range, it became the gold standard of bolt-action engineering and was licensed, copied, and adapted by militaries from Turkey to Argentina. America arrived slightly late, fielding the Springfield 1903, a design so structurally similar to the Mauser that the U.S. government quietly paid Mauser royalties until World War I made that arrangement politically impossible. The philosophy behind all three was identical: accuracy at distance, durability in the field. Rifles built not for a single campaign, but for decades of service. These were instruments of empire, designed for soldiers who were expected to train extensively, maintain their weapons obsessively, and engage enemies at ranges where individual marksmanship decided outcomes. Smaller nations followed the leaders: Chile, Persia, Belgium, Brazil. Dozens of countries adopted Mauser pattern rifles wholesale, often purchasing them directly from German factories. The bolt action became the universal military language of the early 20th century, but not every nation got it right. France fielded the Liebel, an 1886 design with an awkward tubular magazine that stacked rounds nose to primer, making pointed modern ammunition genuinely dangerous to load. Engineers recognized the flaw almost immediately. France kept the rifle anyway through 2 world wars, decades of colonial conflict, and long past any reasonable service life. Institutional inertia had claimed its first victim. By 1914, the bolt action ruled every battlefield on Earth, but the trenches were about to expose everything it couldn't do. The semi-automatic rifle was born from frustration. World War I trenches had exposed a fundamental truth about modern combat. Volume of fire mattered more than precision. A soldier cycling a bolt between every shot was a soldier breaking his aim, losing his target, and falling behind an enemy who wasn't. The math was brutal and obvious. Militaries spent the next 2 decades trying to solve it. The problem wasn't the concept, it was execution. Gas-operated mechanisms fouled in field conditions. Early prototypes were heavier than the bolt actions they were meant to replace. Tolerances tight enough to function reliably in a factory became death sentences in mud, sand, and rain. And nation after nation launched development programs through the 1920s and 30s, and nation after nation quietly shelved the results when the prototypes failed field trials. America got there first. The M1 Garand, adopted in 1936, became the first semi-automatic rifle issued as standard equipment to an entire major military. It was reliable, robust, and genuinely soldier-proof under most conditions. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. In the Pacific, in North Africa, in the frozen hills of Italy, it delivered. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, in a self-contained en-bloc clip that ejected automatically when empty, producing the distinctive metallic ping that has since become one of the most mythologized sounds in firearms history. In reality, the tactical significance of that sound was minimal. The rifle's performance was not. Others stumbled badly. The Soviet SVT-40, rushed into mass production ahead of the German invasion, was mechanically sophisticated and genuinely capable in trained hands. The problem was trained hands. Soviet conscripts in 1941 were often barely trained at all. The SVT-40's gas system required careful adjustment and regular maintenance that frontline conditions rarely permitted. Production was eventually redirected towards simpler weapons. Germany's own semi-auto answer, the Gewehr 43, arrived late, in limited numbers, and too close to the war's end to change anything. France didn't seriously attempt the transition, neither did Japan. Italy fielded a semi-auto design so mechanically unreliable it was quietly withdrawn. These nations entered the war's most intense fighting with updated bolt actions, and they paid for it every time the distances closed and the firing rates mattered. The lesson was clear: a faster trigger was worthless without reliability. But across the Soviet Union, one engineer was already drawing something that would make the entire debate obsolete. The age of the semi-auto was barely over before something far more radical was about to replace it entirely. The AK-47 did not win on merit alone. It won because it was right for its moment. Post-war Soviet analysts combed through the data of 4 years of the most intensive land warfare in human history. What they found contradicted almost every assumption that had shaped rifle design for a century. The vast majority of infantry combat had occurred at ranges under 300 meters, often far under. In the rubble of Stalingrad, in the forests of Belarus, in the frozen approaches to Moscow, soldiers had fought and died at distances where a precisely engineered long-range cartridge was statistically overkill. All that power, all that recoil, largely wasted. Mikhail Kalashnikov began designing in 1945. He was 26 years old, a tank commander recovering from wounds, with no formal engineering degree and an idea he couldn't let go. What emerged after years of iteration and Soviet institutional support was adopted in 1949. It was not the most accurate rifle of its era. It was not the most ergonomic. By the precise measurements Western engineers valued, it was deliberately crude. Loose tolerances, simple components, a gas system with enough room to function even when packed with debris. That was the point. The AK-47 was engineered for a conscript army, for soldiers pulled from collective farms and factory floors with weeks of training rather than months, for maintenance performed in the field without specialized tools, in temperatures that cracked metal and froze mechanisms solid. Every design decision was a political and military calculation as much as an engineering one. The Soviet Union needed a rifle that almost anyone could use under almost any condition. Kalashnikov gave them one. The consequences were geopolitical and immediate. Soviet foreign policy in the 1950s and 60s moved the AK the way trade winds moved cargo, consistently, powerfully, and in one direction. Warsaw Pact nations received it as standard issue. Liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, Vietnam, and Cuba received it as revolution made tangible. By the late 1960s, dozens of countries had their main military rifle not because of procurement decisions or field trials, but because Moscow had decided they should. American soldiers first encountered it in significant numbers in Vietnam. The reports that came back were uncomfortable. Here was a rifle designed by a wounded tank driver with no engineering credentials, manufactured in communist factories, issued to peasant armies, and it worked reliably, consistently. In heat and humidity that was already beginning to expose serious problems with what America had brought to replace it. The Soviets had armed half the world with a single idea, and the West was about to learn exactly how badly it had underestimated them. The M16 nearly lost America a war before it fired a shot in anger. The United States entered the 1960s confident. The M14 was their answer to the AK, a full-power, semi-automatic battle rifle built on proven American engineering principles. It looked good on paper. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, it revealed itself as something else entirely. Too long for dense vegetation, too heavy for soldiers already carrying days of supplies. Nearly uncontrollable on full automatic, its powerful cartridge climbing off target after the first round. The M14 was a rifle designed for a war that wasn't being fought. Eugene Stoner had a different idea. His AR-15 design was lighter, smaller, and chambered a smaller intermediate cartridge. Early testing results were extraordinary. reliability figures that seemed almost too good, terminal performance that impressed even skeptical Army observers. The Air Force adopted it first. Then political pressure, inter-service rivalry, and the urgency of an escalating war pushed it toward full Army adoption as the M16. That was where the trouble started. The Army's procurement process introduced a change that would prove catastrophic. The powder specification for the ammunition was altered late in development, significantly increasing the rifle's cyclic rate. Faster cycling meant fouling accumulated faster. The chamber and bore, originally chrome-lined in prototype testing, had that feature removed during cost-cutting. And then, remarkably, the Army marketed the rifle to troops as self-cleaning, meaning soldiers deployed to Vietnam without adequate cleaning equipment, without proper field manuals, and without any real understanding of what their new rifle needed to survive. The results were devastating. Soldiers reported rifles jamming mid-firefight, rounds failing to extract, actions freezing at the worst possible moments. Men were found dead with their rifles disassembled beside them, attempting emergency clearing procedures under fire. A congressional investigation in 1967 confirmed what soldiers already knew. The rifle that had arrived with so much promise had been compromised by institutional shortcuts, bureaucratic inertia, and a procurement process that had prioritized speed over soldiers. The recovery was slow and methodical. Chrome-lined chambers and bores were reinstated. A forward assist was added. Cleaning kits became standard issue. Training was updated. Over several years of iterative fixes, the M16 was transformed, not quickly and not without cost, but genuinely into the reliable platform it had originally promised to be. NATO allies had watched every stage of the saga. Some adopted the M16 anyway, trusting the fixes. Others, like Israel, looked at the AK's reliability and the M16's troubled history and decided to find their own answer. The result was the Galil, a hybrid that borrowed freely from Finnish AK derivatives and attempted to split the difference between Eastern durability and Western precision. It was a smart rifle. It still lost to politics. Europe was watching America's stumbles and drawing its own conclusions, and the rifles that emerged from that reckoning would reveal just how differently nations define the word reliable. Europe's rifle problem was never really about rifles. NATO's push for ammunition standardization in the 1970s and 80s forced every member nation into an uncomfortable corner. Standardized ammunition meant interoperability. Any ally supply truck could feed any ally's rifle in a crisis. The logic was sound. The politics were brutal. For European nations with proud domestic arms, industries, and distinct military traditions, the implicit message was harder to swallow. Adopt American platforms, or spend enormous sums developing your own. There was no comfortable middle ground. West Germany chose independence. The G3, produced by Heckler & Koch, was reliable and mechanically robust, a roller-delayed blowback design that handled the full-power NATO cartridge with mechanical efficiency. What it couldn't handle was recoil. The full-power 7.62mm round generated punishment that smaller-statured soldiers found genuinely difficult to manage across extended engagements. Germany issued it anyway. So did Portugal, Norway, Pakistan, Iran, and dozens of others who licensed or purchased it, drawn by its durability and relatively low cost. The G3 became one of the most widely distributed rifles of the Cold War era, not because it was perfect, but because it was affordable and available. Belgium went further. The FNFAL earned its nickname, the free world's right arm, honestly. Over 90 countries adopted it at peak distribution, making it the Western world's de facto answer to the AK. It was accurate, reliable in temperate conditions, and chambered the standard NATO cartridge with authority. Then came the Falklands. Argentine and British forces, both carrying FAL pattern rifles, fought in cold, wet, sandy South Atlantic conditions that exposed the design's vulnerability to environmental contamination. The open-bottom receiver collected debris. Reliability suffered. The war was won, but the rifle's reputation carried new footnotes afterward. France refused the entire conversation. Rather than join NATO's standardization program, France developed the FAMAS, a bullpup design that placed the magazine behind the trigger group, allowing a shorter overall package without sacrificing barrel length. The concept was sound. The execution was expensive, mechanically idiosyncratic, and difficult to manufacture at scale. Reloading from standard issue pouches was awkward. Spare parts were costly. France carried it for decades, more from sunk cost commitment than satisfaction, before finally replacing it with a Belgian-made rifle, a quiet institutional admission that the experiment had its limits. Britain's experience was worse. The SA-80, designated the L-85, arrived in the mid-1980s promising to modernize British infantry. Instead, it delivered failures in desert heat, Arctic cold, and tropical humidity simultaneously. The early variants jammed, parts broke. Left-handed soldiers couldn't use it safely due to the bullpup's ejection design. It took a contracted redesign by Heckler & Koch in the early 2000s, expensive, time-consuming, and quietly embarrassing, to produce a version British soldiers could trust in combat. While Europe wrestled with its rifle identity, an entirely different tier of nations was solving the same problem with far fewer resources, and sometimes arriving at far more interesting answers. The most interesting rifles of the Cold War weren't made in Moscow or Washington. Outside the two great power blocks, a tier of nations faced the same fundamental problem with radically different resources. They needed reliable infantry rifles, they had limited budgets, inconsistent supply chains, and no superpower patron willing to hand them a solution for free. What emerged from that pressure was some of the most pragmatic and occasionally brilliant military engineering of the 20th century. China began by copying the Type 56, a domestic reproduction of the AK-47, entered People's Liberation Army service in the late 1950s and was manufactured in staggering numbers. But China didn't stop there. Decades of iterative development eventually produced the QBZ-95, a bullpup design chambering a unique domestic cartridge, reflecting both accumulated engineering confidence and a deliberate political decision to reduce dependence on foreign ammunition standards. The message was clear. China was done borrowing other people's ideas. Yugoslavia told a different story. Formally non-aligned and deeply suspicious of both Moscow and Washington, Yugoslavia developed the Zastava M70, an AK pattern rifle with meaningful engineering departures from the Soviet original. A thicker trunnion, a cold hammer-forged barrel, reinforced components throughout. Gunsmiths and collectors who have examined both designs extensively often argue the M70 is the most mechanically durable AK pattern rifle ever produced. A small, independent nation had taken a superpower's flagship design and quietly made it better. Israel's path was the most instructive and the most ironic. The Galil, developed in the late 1960s and drawing inspiration from the Finnish RK-62, itself an AK derivative, was a genuinely capable rifle, accurate, reliable, well-suited to desert conditions. Israeli engineers had solved real problems elegantly. Then U.S. military aid arrived, making M16 pattern rifles effectively free to Israeli defense forces. The Galil was sidelined from frontline service not because it failed, but because it couldn't compete with free. Economics defeated engineering. Across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, the picture was starker still. A country's main military rifle often reflected nothing more than who had last provided foreign aid. Soviet patron, AK variants; American patron, M16 variants; French sphere of influence, aging famous derivatives, or licensed European designs. The rifle on a soldier's shoulder was a geopolitical indicator as reliable as a flag. Nations didn't always choose their weapons. Their weapons were chosen for them. The developing world had demonstrated that innovation thrives under constraint. But as the Cold War ended and new threats emerged, every nation on Earth was about to face a question their current rifles weren't designed to answer. The M4 carbine didn't replace the M16, it shrank it down and conquered the world. The Cold War's end didn't bring the peace dividend military planners had promised. What it brought instead was a different kind of war: counterinsurgency in narrow alleyways, raids on urban compounds. Special operations in vehicles where a full-length rifle barrel was a liability before the door even opened. The threat had changed shape, and the rifle had to follow. Shorter, lighter, modular enough to be reconfigured for the mission rather than the other way around. The M4 answered that call. A shortened M16 derivative with a collapsible stock and a barrel trimmed for close-quarters work, it became the dominant infantry weapon of the Western world's post-Cold War campaigns. NATO allies adopted it or built direct equivalents. American military aid spread it further still. By the mid-2000s, it was everywhere. Carried by American soldiers in Baghdad, Afghan National Army recruits in Kandahar, and security forces across a dozen nations whose governments had signed the right partnership agreements. The bullpup format found its moment too. The Austrian AUG, adopted as early as 1977, had spent decades as an elegant outlier. Shorter than conventional rifles, well-balanced, genuinely reliable, but slow to gain international traction. Now its logic made sense to more buyers. The Israeli Taver resolved the bullpup's notorious trigger feel problem well enough for frontline adoption. Singapore's SAR-21 reflected a small nation's determination to field a domestically developed design capable of competing with imported alternatives. Each solved the bullpup equation differently. Each found customers among nations reassessing what modern infantry actually needed. Russia modernized too, though less cleanly. The AK-12 updated Kalashnikov's platform with rail systems, improved ergonomics, and a cleaner sight picture, a necessary acknowledgement that 70-year-old ergonomics had limits. Simultaneously, Russia funded the AN-94, an extraordinarily complex design featuring a unique two-round hyperburst mechanism intended to defeat body armor at combat ranges. It worked in controlled conditions. In the field, its mechanical complexity defeated it. Frontline adoption was minimal. It was quietly shelved. Another brilliant idea that forgot to account for the soldier carrying it. The caliber debate ignited last and loudest. Concerns that standard 5.56mm ammunition underperformed against modern body armor prompted the US NGSW program, eventually producing the XM5, chambered in 6.8mm. Allies standardized on 5.56mm watched with unease. A new cartridge meant new logistics, new training, new supply chains, and potential incompatibility with every partner nation's ammunition stocks. The world's rifles had never been more capable. The arguments about what they should fire had never been louder. A century of warfare had produced extraordinary weapons and endless debate, and as the smoke cleared, only one question remained: who was actually carrying all of them? The world's armies, surveyed honestly, carry a surprisingly small number of ideas. Strip away the national markings, the domestic designations, the political branding applied by governments eager to claim indigenous capability, and the global infantry rifle map resolves into two dominant family trees: a K-pattern rifles on one side, M16 and M4 derivatives on the other. Everything else, the bullpups and the hybrids, and the domestically developed outliers, exists in the margins, influential margins, occasionally brilliant margins, but margins nonetheless. The outliers tell the best stories. Switzerland fields the SIG-550, arguably the most precisely manufactured mass-issue rifle ever adopted by any military, built to tolerances that embarrass most competitors and priced accordingly. Switzerland never seriously attempted to export it at scale. The cost made that conversation short. Finland's RK-95 represents the quiet apex of the AK pattern's evolution in Western hands. Reliable, accurate, cold weather capable, and almost entirely unknown outside the small nation that carries it. South Korea's K2 achieved something genuinely rare: a domestically developed design that freed a nation from foreign procurement dependency entirely, built from scratch by an industry determined to stop buying other people's answers. Then there are the nations still carrying rifles older than their soldiers, Across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, militaries field AK-pattern weapons from the 1960s and 70s, maintained through improvised means, cannibalizing parts from non-functional siblings, kept operational through ingenuity born entirely of necessity. These rifles have outlasted the governments that issued them, the conflicts that first deployed them, and the manufacturers that originally built them. They endure because there is no budget to replace them, and no alternative arriving to fill the gap. The emerging wildcard reshapes the entire conversation: drone warfare, proliferating body armor, and the intensity of modern urban combat are pushing serious military planners to question assumptions that have governed infantry doctrine for a century. If a drone can engage a target at ranges that dwarf any rifle's practical capability, and if body armor continues advancing faster than intermediate cartridges can answer it, the rifle-centric infantry model itself begins to look like a premise in need of revision. And yet, walk into any conflict zone on Earth today. Survey the weapons being carried. The answer comes back the same way it has for 70 years. Two men, one a Soviet tank commander with no engineering degree, sketching ideas in a military hospital in 1945. The other an American engineer whose greatest design was nearly destroyed by the institution that adopted it. Between them, Mikhail Kalashnikov and Eugene Stoner armed the modern world. And despite